I have another amendment. I have been informed that the majority plans to block consideration of this amendment, which is number 1367, regarding the transparency at the Federal Reserve. I would nonetheless like to take a few moments to discuss it, if that is
without objection.
Okay with me. Thank you. The Federal Reserve, the unelected central bank of the United States, enjoys a monopoly over the flow of our money and credit, but has never been completely transparent and accountable to Congress since its creation in 1913. Since 1913, our dollar has lost more than 95% of its purchasing power. My amendment is called the Federal Reserve Sunshine Amendment, and it is modeled after legislation sponsored by Representative Ron Paul of Texas in the House and our colleague Senator Sanders of Vermont here in the Senate. This amendment amends Section 714 of Title 31 of the U.S. Code to remove existing restrictions on how the Government Accounting Office can audit the Federal Reserve. With these limitations gone, the Fed's discount window operation, funding facilities, open market operations, and agreements with foreign central banks and governments would all be finally open to congressional oversight. The Government Accounting Office would be required to audit the Fed by the end of 2010 and to report its findings to Congress. Every dollar created by the Fed has an effect on the value of the dollars in our pockets and bank accounts. We need to pay more attention to the effect of Washington decisions, whether fiscal policy made by Congress or monetary policy made by the Fed. They all are ultimately borne by the American people. The Federal Reserve will create and disperse trillions of dollars in response to our current financial crisis. Americans across the nation, regardless of their opinion on the bailout, want to know where the money has gone, exactly how much has been spent, and what collateral has been taken in return. That is why you see so much bipartisan support in the House, in Bernie Sanders and Jim DeMint being on the same side in the Senate. Inflation is a hidden tax, and we unfortunately forget about it too often when we are debating spending bills here in Congress. Our fiscal actions, higher deficits, increased long-term debt, entitlement obligations will necessarily need to be paid for by printing new money or borrowing more money from an increasingly skeptical world. Either option results in higher interest rates for consumers and a devaluing of the dollars they have already earned and saved. Allowing the Fed to operate our nation's monetary system in almost complete secrecy leads to abuse, inflation, and a lower quality of life for every American. Unfortunately, the majority has decided to use a procedural tactic to block a vote on this amendment by invoking something called Rule 16. This is a rule that prevents policy being added to spending bills. The majority claims that we do not legislate on appropriation bills. Of course, that is false. In fact, there are already Rule 16 violations in the bill we're trying to amend. We also saw this majority airdrop the Cash for Clunkers program into the recent supplemental appropriation bill. The majority may claim that this amendment is not relevant to the underlying bill, but in fact, there are already provisions in this bill related to the Government Accounting Office audits. So this language is quite appropriate on this bill. The legislation has already received the support of more than one-half of the House of Representatives within a few short months of its introduction. It's time for the Senate to show its support. Mr. President, I would like to ask the Majority Leader again to allow a vote on Amendment 1367 regarding a GAO audit of the Federal Reserve.
Senator from Nebraska. Oh, I'm sorry.
Not yet.
Madam President, I'd like to call up Amendment 1367.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
The Senator from South Carolina, Mr. DeMint, proposes amendment number 1367.
Senator from Nebraska.
I make a point of order against the DeMint amendment that it's legislation on appropriations.
Madam President?
The point of order is well taken. The amendment.
I regret the objection.
The amendment falls.
If I would like to make just a few comments about that, since the other side is arguing that Rule 16 applies here. My amendment contains language to an existing GAO audit of the Federal Reserve because it is legislative in nature, and in other words, because it actually addresses the audit itself and not just the funds for the General Accounting Office. They say because of that it's out of order. And Madam President, I'd like to ask a parliamentary inquiry. Is the language in Section 1501B dealing with an existing GAO audit of the National Transportation Safety Board legislative?
It is.
I thank the Chair. Does it violate Rule 16?
It does.
So the Democrats are suggesting that it is somehow illegitimate for me to offer an amendment dealing with an existing GAO audit when they themselves have included language dealing with other audits that flatly violates Rule 16. Madam President, just further parliamentary inquiry. Is the language in Section 1501C regarding a GAO audit of local educational agency spending legislative in nature and in violation of Rule 16?
Yes.
I thank the Chair. What about Section 1501D, which repeals a GAO audit of small business participation in the Alaska National Pipeline? Is that legislative in nature, and does it violate Rule 16?
Yes, it is.
I have a long list that are here that I understand from the parliamentarian that the answers will continue to be yes. So, Madam President, we have several provisions obviously dealing with the GAO and GAO audits in this bill. The other side cannot stand behind a rule that they have flagrantly violated themselves. There is an earmark in this bill for Nebraska. It's the only earmark in the bill. I would ask the Chair, what about the provisions in the Library of Congress section containing a $200,000 earmark for Durham Museum in Omaha, Nebraska? Is that a legislative item? And does it violate Rule 16?
It is legislative, but the Chair is aware of a defense in germaneness.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, then, would it be accurate to say that the provision contains legislative language that meets the definition of Rule 16, even though it is arguably germane to the House language?
It is legislative in nature.
Well, thank you, Madam President. I think I've made my point, and I won't take this any further. Clearly, there's a double standard here. One of the most, I think, sought-after amendments that we have probably brought up in the House and the Senate since I've been here is an audit of the Federal Reserve. Everywhere I went last week, people were thanking me for finally looking at what the Federal Reserve was doing and trying to let the American people know what is happening. This is an audit that has broad support, and I would encourage my colleagues on the Democrat side to allow this amendment to be voted on, but apparently the other side has decided to challenge it with a Rule 16, which they don't apply to their own language. But as I said, Madam Chairman, I've probably said enough, and I thank you for your indulgence, and I'll yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will